Hi, and welcome to our talk on sustainable international development. My name's Christa Cook,
My name is Shugart-Schmidt.
and we're here to speak a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, international development versus humanitarian aid, and how we can make projects sustainable. So a little background about ourselves. I got my undergraduate degree in civil engineering from Louisiana State University in 2015. I then worked for a civil firm for a year working on a sanitation sewer overflow project in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Then I joined the Peace Corps, where I was a water, sanitation, and hygiene engineer for 2 years, 2016 to 2018 in Peru.
So my background is in civil and environmental engineering. I got my degree at the University of Utah, after which I worked for a private design and construction firm in northern Utah and southern Idaho. After leaving that position, I joined the Peace Corps, and I was a WASH volunteer, water, sanitation, and hygiene volunteer for 4 years in northern Peru, after which I came to Villanova University.
So first we'd like to talk a little bit about what is the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is funded by the American government, and they send Americans abroad to work on various types of projects. For us, it was water, sanitation, and hygiene, WASH. There's also business, environmental, and teaching English. In Indonesia, there are Peace Corps volunteers, and their sole job is teaching English. So let's talk a little bit about sustainability. Sustainability is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So in short, enough for all, forever.
And that's sort of from a broader context, right? So it's, in English you'd say big S sustainability with a capital S, means that it's a global context. But when we're talking more in development work, it's the small s sustainability. So how is it applicable to individual projects and individual contexts that allow for the promotion of internally driven, internally built, and internally managed projects and environments?
So sustainability, most people have it composed of 3 pillars: economic, environmental, and social. Some people also informally call this profits, planet, and people, the 3 Ps. But here at Villanova, we like to take that a step further and add 2 more pillars. So altogether we have 5 pillars called STEEP: social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And the whole point of these pillars is that you need each of them to be sustainable to ensure project sustainability. Not one is more important than the other, rather than they are all interconnected, and if one fails, ultimately the entire project will fail. So there's one case study we were reading about where Oxfam went into a predominantly Muslim country and built bathrooms without talking to the local people there. They came back and realized that nobody's building these bathrooms, and they couldn't figure out why. The bathrooms technologically worked, they economically were viable, they were environmentally friendly. Politically, the government had sponsored these bathrooms, but what they missed out on was the social context. These bathrooms were facing Mecca, and nobody in this community who sees Mecca as their holy grounds wanted to use the bathroom facing Mecca. So for an NGO coming in who's not familiar with the context, this may seem trivial, but for the community, this was a big deal. So the project absolutely was fully unsustainable based on the social aspects.
And that's a great example of where you need buy-in from all levels, right? So you had the international NGO who came in with this project idea, worked with the national government, and everything seemed fine on that level. But without the lower levels, no less important, the community input, the upper level project was never going to be sustainable, right? It was built, it feasibly, it worked, but without that lower level sustainability, that inclusion, it was never going to be a successful project.
So let's talk a little bit about the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. These were 8 goals with measurable targets and clear deadlines for improving the lives of the world's poorest people. These goals were from 2000 till 2015, and there was 189 countries who participated in these goals. The MDGs had some mild success. The very first MDG was reducing extreme poverty rates, meaning people living on just $1.5 USD a day. That was met by the 2015 deadline, where globally the number of people living in extreme poverty had fallen from 1.9 billion to 836 million by 2015.
So one of the big issues that was seen with the MDGs principally was it was sort of a top-down approach again. It wasn't a collaboratively developed bottom-up approach. So it would be the context of United Nations countries, developed some countries coming together and deciding what was best for the rest of the world. And while there was a great deal of success, it was able to reduce, for example, the number of people living in extreme poverty. It also suffered from the problem of ease of access. And so in development work, ease of access means development projects and international NGOs will focus on the places that they can actually get to, right? So that could be focusing on urban areas rather than rural, or peri-urban, semi-urban areas, as opposed to slum areas where you just can't get in and work safely, for example. So there was this issue of where was this defined and where was it focused. Additionally, specifically for the people living in extreme poverty, the greatest progress was made in China, which just through general economic development cut that number almost in half. So there was a great deal of debate about, were the efforts from the UN actually making the greatest change in lifting people out of extreme poverty, or was it internal development based out of China or other developing countries? So there was this issue of, is the MDG successful, and who is driving that success? Is it independent of the UN, or was it based on this collaborative effort?
So while there's a lot of criticisms of the MDGs, one of the best things it did was just get the whole world to come together to decide on a few goals that it would like to reach. So that leads us to the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals were from 2015 till 2030. So again, the MDGs were from 2000 to 2015, 15-year time span, and then the SDGs are 2015 to 2030. So the Sustainable Development Goals follow and expand on the Millennium Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are a set of 17 goals, whereas the Millennium Development Goals were only 8. And there are 168, I believe, 162 countries participating in the Sustainable Development Goals. So since these are newer goals and what the world is currently focusing on, we're going to run through each goal individually so you can be familiar with the SDGs.
So goal 1 is to reduce global poverty to 0.
Goal 2 is zero hunger.
Goal 3, good health and well-being.
Goal 4 is quality education.
Goal 5 is gender equality.
Goal 6 is clean water and sanitation.
Goal 7 is affordable and clean energy.
Goal 8 is decent work and economic growth.
Goal 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure.
Goal 10 is reduced inequality.
Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities.
Goal 12 is responsible consumption and production.
Goal 13 is climate action.
Goal 14 is life below water.
Goal 15 is life on land.
Goal 16 is peace and justice, strong institutions.
And goal 17 is partnerships to achieve the goal.
So in Indonesia in 2019 reported how they're doing on these goals. And Indonesia's currently ranked 102 out of 162 countries who are participating. So as of 2019, Indonesia is on track to achieve SDG 1, 8, and 13. SDG 1, again, being no poverty. SDG 8 is decent work and economic growth. And SDG 13 is climate action. So for the first SDG, no poverty, from 2014 to 2018, the poverty rate in Indonesia decreased from 11.25% to 9.82%, which is significant. For Goal 8, the GDP, the gross domestic product of Indonesia, grew consistently by 5% every year from 2014 to 2018.
The SDG, so in terms of unsuccessful development areas, the SDG 15 is declining, which is life on land. SDG 5, 14, and 17 are all stagnant, which means they're not on track to meet the 2030 goal. So goal 5 being gender equality.
Goal
14 being life below water, and goal 17 being partnerships to achieve the goal.
According to the report put out by the Indonesian government, the significant challenges facing Indonesia are limited access to responsive public services, unequal quality education and economic opportunity, limited compliance of public services with national standards, as well as inadequate data and information.
In terms of good governance, corruption is being reduced. There's a lack of access to quality public information as well as just basic information in general, and there's a lack of inclusive data and policy making and implementation.
So out of these 17 goals, Wes and I mostly work on goal number 6, access to clean water and sanitation. That's what we did in the Peace Corps, and that's what we are currently doing, pursuing our master's degree in sustainable international development here at Villanova University.
So there are some big differences and distinctions in how international aid and humanitarian relief are sort of centralized and focused. Christa, what do you think are the differences between international development and humanitarian aid?
It's a great question. Humanitarian aid is designed to save lives and alleviate suffering during and in the immediate aftermath of emergencies, whereas development aid responds to ongoing structural issues, particularly systemic poverty, that may hinder economic, institutional, and social development in any given society. Development aid focuses on capacity building to ensure resilient communities and sustainable livelihoods. So Wes and I mostly focus on development aid, meaning when we go and do these water projects abroad in other countries, for both of us, that's mostly in Latin America, we focus extensively on making sure the people, our local partners, our Latin American partners, know how these systems are built, how their operations, how they're maintained, and in all 5 areas of STEEP: socially, technologically, environmentally, economically, and politically. So that way, because we're going to leave, since they are there, they will ensure sustainability in the future.
It's all really about capacity building, be it from a management standpoint, making sure they can properly manage the system that the government or an international NGO came in and built. A great example of that being is if you have a water treatment system in a rural context and it works perfectly and it's great, once the NGO leaves or once the government hands off ownership to the local municipality or a water committee, if they're unable to maintain that system past the initial period, then the system becomes essentially useless. If they don't know how to clean it, maintain the valves, make sure that they get enough materials to maintain the filter systems, it just is not a sustainable product.
Do you have any projects that you've worked on that were not sustainable?
Yeah, so one of my main projects when I was in the Peace Corps was working on a chlorination system installation on 5 distinct systems in northern Amazonas. As part of that, we identified water committees who were interested in working with it. My counterpart agency, the local municipality, and the health center all worked together to do almost a year's worth of trainings to try and develop this sort of baseline capacity so that once we started installing and building the systems, there'd be this continuity past the initial installation so they could keep that sustainable, water treatment sustainable. One of our greatest issues were these water committees were all volunteer positions, which means that they were doing it out of the kindness of their own heart and their civic duty, right? Once we get through that entire year's worth of training with a little bit of turnover from the water committees, we began the building of the systems and built 5 chlorination systems with the associated infrastructure required. After that installation, which took about 5 months, we handed off those systems to the water committees. Unfortunately, we ignored one or more of the STEEP components, most specifically the economic part and the social part, in that as we were completing our system, a major national government project began in our district, which was paid and provided work. What that meant was that as work was being developed for this project, all of our volunteers left the water committees to go work for this project, because of course they need to support their families and make sure that they had enough to live on. Unfortunately, because we had focused so exclusively on the water committee members, there was no continuity. So when they were replaced by community members, none of them had any knowledge about how to work the chlorination systems, the importance of chlorinating, treatment systems in general, maintenance, operation, administration. All of that was lost. So I think that's a pretty great example of not being sustainable. We had the system, it worked, and then it all fell apart.
So Wes and I got the opportunity to travel to Panama last week, where we worked on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math outreach at a local high school there. This was a relatively sustainable project because socially, the students were engaged and interested. The teacher was there, the Panamanian professor was there helping us and also learning how to do this for when we leave. He could do it on his own. Technologically, it was a technically simple project. We had the students build bridges out of popsicle sticks and glue to learn about tension and compression, to learn about different types of bridges. And economically, this was very affordable because the project materials were very cheap, locally available. Environmentally, this has a low environmental impact because we're using mostly natural materials, wood popsicle sticks, namely. And politically, this was basically apolitical, neither good or bad politically. There was nobody is gonna be mad about us coming in to teach engineering concepts to high school students. So that's an example of a good, sustainable project.
We also slotted in nicely to the National Science Week, which met perfectly with their institutional priorities for that week. So it worked out really nicely. What do you think was a project you were involved in the Peace Corps that had some context for international development?
That was sustainable?
That was sustainable or not sustainable?
So one project I did in the Peace Corps was a reforestation project. This was a really great project. Ideally, it should be sustainable. Me and the high school got together and we planted over 1,000 trees. Our problem that made it a little less sustainable environmentally was that we thought we were planting at the very beginning of the wet season when it's going to rain a lot. So basically, since we're planting these in the middle of nowhere, we needed to water these plants, but if we did it during the rainy season, then naturally they would get watered. But due to climate change, the rainy season has started to shift a little bit, so we planted them too early, basically. They didn't get enough water, but we lost about 500 trees. The other 500 at least made it past the first season. I don't know about the second rainy season, but we lost a lot based on bad timing and climate change.
Can you speak at all about the importance of working with counterpart agencies as opposed to international NGOs working on their own?
Yeah, of course. So without the local partners, you're just going to miss so many obvious errors. For instance, with the example of the bathrooms being built in Mecca, the international NGO came in and didn't speak. They didn't gain the local knowledge, didn't speak to local people, and therefore made a huge error and built bathrooms that were ultimately not going to be used. So it's extremely crucial to partner with local people who can give you that local perspective, not only for the implementation, but also for the maintenance and operation, because international NGOs are going to leave. They're going to come and do their job, and then they're going to leave. The people who are going to stay are the community members, and those are the people who are also the main benefactors, people who are going to really benefit from these projects, and therefore it will be their responsibility to maintain them, both economically, environmentally, and technically. So there's no nothing more sustainable than constantly being in partners with local people.
So over the course of this little chat, we've talked about a bunch of different stuff, and we want to just give you a nice little review, a nice little summary of the bullet point items that we talked about.
So first, we defined sustainability. Enough for all, forever.
Then we moved on to the MDGs, talking about what they were and some of the drawbacks that has led to further improvements.
We also spoke about STEEP, the social, technical, economic, environmental, and political aspects of any project, and the importance of all 5 of those aspects working together to keep a project sustainable.
We then moved on to talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, what they are, what the goals are, how it relates to Indonesia, and then as it relates to WASH.
So remember, the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. And the Millennium Development Goals were only 8. The Millennium Development Goals were from 2000 to 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals are from 2015 until 2030.
Remember that the SDGs are an iteration on the MDGs, where the MDGs are very top-down. The SDGs were focused on being more of a collaborative approach, building amongst countries both developing and developed.
Then we touched on the difference between humanitarian and development aid. Humanitarian aid is mostly aid that comes during a disaster. For example, there was a lot of humanitarian aid in northern Indonesia after a tsunami there. And development aid is more systemic, long-term aid that is working with local governments, that's working with infrastructure, that's anything that takes a long time.
It's focused on issues and not events.
Lastly, we spoke a little bit about the projects we're working on. Wes and his chlorination project, our project together working on STEM outreach, and my reforestation project in Peru.
Remember always, international development aid is incredibly difficult and incredibly complex. There are thousands and thousands of different aspects of which each on its own can cause a project to fail. The most important thing that anyone can do is to make sure that you are developing a project with the stakeholders and valuing their opinions, because they ultimately are the ones that will make a project successful or fail in the long term.
So we would like to thank Ria for inviting us to speak today, and we'd like to thank you for listening as well.
Have a wonderful day.